We entered a hooch. These people are aware of what American soldiers do to them, so naturally they try to hide the young girls. We found one hiding in a bomb shelter in sort of the basement of her house. She was taken out and raped by 6 or 7 people in front of her family, in front of most of the villagers.
During the Vietnam War, the atrocities committed by the belligerents against the civilian population were brutal. Many American soldiers and military personnel viewed the locals as subhuman, motivated by racism and decades of fighting on the Asian continent. This is why war crimes were not only ignored, but sometimes even ordered, and once committed were quickly covered up. Vietnamese women in particular suffered barbaric treatment by American troops and their allies, including torture and rape that often ended in murder. For the invaders, these sadistic actions were simply another type of weapon to use against an enemy hiding among the civilian population. What was most terrible was that the abuses not only affected the people who experienced them, but their effects would last for decades. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the rape and torture of women during the Vietnam War. After gaining independence from France in 1954, Vietnam was divided into 2 parts. To the north, the government was held by the Communist Party, an ally of the Soviet Union. The south was controlled by colonial sympathizers, partners of the United States. But the North Vietnamese sought the reunification of the territory. For a year, the 2 states maintained a tense relationship. However, South Vietnam harshly repressed its detractors, and this finally exploded on November 1st, 1955. That was the day that the National Liberation Front, which would later be known as the Viet Cong, began its armed actions against the South Vietnamese government. This party was supported by the Northerners, who soon after began to provide supplies to its forces. This was followed by many years of terrible fighting between the 2 factions, joined by armies from other countries. In the mid-1965s, American troops, supporting South Vietnam, began arriving in large numbers to fight the guerrillas. American public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of armed intervention, as they saw Northern communism as a threat to their way of life. However, this opinion would soon change. The war was widely covered by the press, which broadcast what was happening on the front almost simultaneously on home television. This meant that, at times, the information could not be altered according to Uncle Sam's intentions. Thus, many of the massacres and brutalities suffered by the Vietnamese people could not be hidden. The cruelty was such that some of them would be responsible for turning a large part of American citizens into strong opponents of the war. A practice that became common for the invading troops was sexual violence. Through these actions, the soldiers exercised violent control over the civilian population, who lived in terror. These men believed they were justified in their actions, since they were little different from the innocent peasant from the Vietnamese communist guerrilla. Any victim was simply collateral damage. Even rape was often considered rewards for the soldiers, or a punishment for the women who suffered it, for collaborating with the enemy. Sometimes, sexual encounters were consensual, or at least they were passed off as such. It is known that Americans based in South Vietnamese bases frequently had intimate relations with women from the country. The act was so naturalized that, within some military bases, brothels were built where women offered their services. The aim of these centers was to raise the morale of the soldiers and give them an outlet for their tension. However, there are many doubts about the consent of such actions. Many specialists believe that these people were forced into prostitution to keep the American troops motivated. In addition, the girls who worked there were often minors. This is how a veteran tells it in the following video.
And I go walking in there, and there's like, I guess there was more than 15 girls, because there was like 11 bunks on one side and like 10 or 12 on the other side. And each and every one of those goddamn bunks had a female sitting in it. And she was about half naked, each one of them. And they're all Vietnamese girls. They're all young, and they're God, some of them must have been just mere children, 14, 15 years old. It was unbelievable to me.
Other soldiers did not see the need to use these facilities to satisfy their desires. It has been proven that were far more frequent than was first believed. Several of these men viewed the local female population as inferior, barely human, and felt they had the right to treat them as they wished. According to some sources, in some cases they even had permission from their superiors to do so, or at least their indifference. On one occasion, a man allegedly said, "You have an M16 rifle. Why would you pay a woman? You just go into town and take what you want." But the atrocities were not limited to the sexual. In many instances, was followed by murder of the victim. Often, these were committed in brutal ways, with the person being tortured and mutilated before their agony was brought to an end. The actions that were carried out are too inhumane to mention in this video. In the chilling words of one Vietnam veteran, "You became a double veteran by killing a woman after having sex with her. For them, performing this diabolical act increased your worth as a soldier." Of the thousands of crimes committed by Americans against Vietnamese, only 40 were convicted in military courts. The vast majority were dismissed, and many others were never prosecuted because their victims were incapable of doing so. Even in several of those that did result in a conviction, the conviction ended up being much lighter than it should have been. In one case, a 13-year-old girl was raped during interrogation by a man who allegedly suspected her of Viet Cong affiliation. The court-martial ordered him to be dishonorably discharged from the army and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. However, after only 7 months had passed, he was released. As we will see below, the reduction of sentences became, unfortunately, a very common practice. There are two cases whose infamy surpasses that of the rest. One of them is known as the Hill 192 incident, which occurred on November 19, 1966. During a reconnaissance mission, a squad of 5 American men kidnapped a 21-year-old Vietnamese girl named Phan Thi Mao. 4 of these soldiers took turns raping her continuously. Their plan was to prolong the abuse for 5 days, but the next morning, 2 of the criminals, Stephen Thomas and David Gervais, began to worry about being discovered. So they decided to take the girl to an inconspicuous part of the jungle and kill her. They stabbed her 3 times and then shot her in the head. The only one of the squad who had not abused the woman, Robert Storby, reported the act to his superiors. They ignored him completely, justifying the action as an unfortunate but inevitable occurrence in a war. Despite threats from those involved, who told him that he would share the girl's fate, Storby persisted until he finally managed to get his companions brought to trial and convicted. But, as often happens in these cases, their sentences were considerably reduced. Gervais, who had been sentenced to 10 years in prison, only served 2. Thomas, who was the one who ended Phan Thi Mao's life, served 3 years, when his initial sentence had been for life. But the most famous war crime committed by American forces during this conflict dwarfs what we have just described. It was so brutal that it is considered one of the acts that twisted public opinion regarding continued military action in Vietnam. We are talking about the My Lai massacre, which occurred on March 16, 1968, and was perpetrated by 2 companies of the American Army. On that day, the soldiers were ordered to search the small village of Sun Mai, where Viet Cong troops were believed to be hiding. According to the words of a captain, all the inhabitants of the place were part of the communist organization, or at least sympathetic to it. When asked if the women and children present should also be considered potential enemies, he reiterated that they all were. The Americans encountered mild resistance when they reached the village. It was true that there were some guerrillas present, but in much smaller numbers than expected. The population was mostly made up of women, children, and the elderly. Still, the soldiers opened fire. According to witnesses, there was no initial act with which the killings began. No one gave the order or a war cry. They simply began to kill. Using bayonets, gunfire, or grenades, the Americans killed their supposed enemy without allowing them to defend themselves in any way. Civilians were herded together and machine-gunned or blown up with grenade launchers. Women holding their babies were killed because the soldiers suspected that they were storing bombs instead of their children. Everyone seemed to have entered into a sadistic frenzy. Showing the cold-bloodedness with which they acted, the killers even paused for lunch. When a helicopter pilot landed to watch the carnage, he asked the lieutenant in charge if he could assist the wounded. The officer replied that the only way to do so would be by means of hand grenades. Let us listen to a witness recount his experience below.
19 women and children were rounded up as Viet Cong suspects, and the lieutenant that rounded them up called the captain on the radio, and he asked what should be done with them. The captain simply repeated the order that came down from the colonel that morning. The order that came down from the colonel that morning was kill anything that moves, which you can take any way you want to take it.
The helicopter crew mentioned above managed to evacuate some people, despite threats from those involved in the massacre. Back at the American base, they told their superiors what had happened, and they ordered an end to the killing. However, the destruction, burning of homes and abuse continued until the next day. By the time the soldiers withdrew, more than 500 people lay dead. In all that time, the only American casualty was a man who shot himself in the foot, so he wouldn't have to participate in the killings. Only 3 enemy weapons were found in the entire town. There are reports of 20 rapes by the troops of Vietnamese women. 9 of them were minors, including the case of a 12-year-old girl. The reality is that investigations into the sexual abuse that occurred during these days were very scarce. In addition, only cases where there was explicit evidence, such as torn clothing or nudity, were considered. For these reasons, and because it is difficult to obtain a true estimate, the actual number of victims is believed to be much higher. Despite the existence of eyewitnesses, not one soldier from either company was accused of rape. You can listen to a veteran's testimony talking about this.
I looked to where the VCS were, supposed VCS, and 2 men were leading a young girl, approximately 19 years old, very pretty, out of a hooch. She had no clothes on, so I assumed she had been raped, which was pretty SOP, and that's standard operating procedure for civilians. And she was thrown onto the pile of the 19 women and children, and 5 men around the circle opened up on full automatic with their M16s. And that was the end of that.
At first, the media portrayed the massacre as an American victory. According to them, all the dead were members of the Viet Cong, who had fallen after a long battle. The civilian casualties were attributed to the inaccuracy of the artillery fire, and therefore completely accidental. But some soldiers began to pressure the military leaders to conduct a thorough investigation of the events, even writing letters to the U.S. Congress. At first, the authorities wanted to cover up everything, but the large number of witnesses and evidence made this impossible. 26 men were tried in a court-martial for war crimes and for concealing information about them. Most of these charges were dropped. In total, of the perpetrators of the My Lai massacre, only 1 was convicted. This was Lieutenant Calley, who was found guilty of 22 counts of premeditated murder. He claimed he was only following orders. He was sentenced to life in prison, but by order of President Richard Nixon, his sentence was reduced to just 3 years of house arrest. Although there is evidence and witnesses for more than 30 other soldiers directly involved in the massacre, none of them were convicted. These actions cannot be attributed to combat fever or adrenaline. The rapes and killings were ordered from the highest ranks of the military chain with the aim of destroying the morale of the population, which was perceived as hostile. Although the directive was not explicit, the deaf ears lent by the authorities gave tacit permission for the soldiers to continue acting in this way. For them, it was just another form of punishment for the enemy. Let us now listen to the words of a daughter born from sexual abuse. Although it happened in another war, she speaks of the use of as a weapon.
is used as a weapon of war, and it's used to dehumanize and desensitize a society. And the trauma and the long-lasting effects that have on the society and the second generation, as I'm a second generation girl born out of sexual violence, it's really hard to overcome, and that shame and stigma will linger for a long time.
But the Americans were not the only ones to perpetrate brutalities against the Vietnamese civilian population. As stated at the beginning of the video, a large number of countries were involved in the conflict, either directly or indirectly. The South Korean government, allied with the Americans and their partners, also sent troops to fight in the jungles of Vietnam. By the late 1970s, around 50,000 soldiers were in the country. According to sources, occurred throughout the war. In some cases, as was also the case with the Americans, men took turns abusing their victim. But unlike the latter, many of the women, after being abused, were not killed, but were kidnapped. If they became pregnant, they were forced to carry the pregnancy to term. Not a single person was tried for these acts, either during or after the war ended. The South Korean government and some military associations reject the veracity of the allegations to this day. According to them, these are lies, and if it is true that it happened, they justify themselves by claiming that the victims were not innocent civilians, but were members of the Viet Cong. Even in Vietnam, these accusations are downplayed and the women ignored, but the evidence cannot be denied. The sons and daughters of the apes are known in the country as Lai Dai Han, which means mixed blood, or half-blood. It is a derogatory term originating from the fact that these people have Korean parents. Raised in a culture that does not recognize the abuse their mothers suffered, they are denied education and limited access to health care. To make matters worse, they are completely marginalized by their peers, who consider them inferior. The exact number is not known, but it is believed to range from 5,000 to 30,000. As stated before, both the Vietnamese and South Korean governments ignore or downplay the matter, continually denying international journalists the opportunity to conduct investigations. You can see how wartime abuses continue to take their toll, even decades after the conflict has ended. Here's what the mother of a Lai Dai Han has to say.
Đi đâu á rồi nó vô nó uống nước cái xong cái nó kéo tôi vô trong buồng á, rồi nó kéo vô trong buồng á, nó hiếp dâm tôi, nó đi việc luôn, chẳng biết ở đâu hết. Hồi nhỏ tới giờ đây cũng cứ chịu vậy thôi, chứ mình có biết ở đâu mà mình đi tìm đi tòi đi hỏi. Tôi không biết tìm ở đâu nữa, mà đi tìm đi kiện ai đi hỏi ai, số phận mình vậy mình chịu thôi chứ đâu không biết đâu. Hồi thời đại chiến tranh mà, dạ, hồi đó thì cũng còn nhỏ quá, cũng không nghĩ. Dạ, bây giờ thì mình nghĩ thì mình cũng tức thôi, chứ cũng giận cũng tức. Rồi họ tới họ làm cho mình khổ, có con rồi vậy rồi mình cũng khổ ghê lắm. Có con rồi người ta hay nói lắm, ta nói rồi mà con đấy nó lấy nước ngoài, nó lấy ra Hàn Quốc đồ là cũng nói vậy. Nó đâu có biết mà ấy, nó có đẻ con thôi, người ta cũng thấy mình có con Hàn Quốc, người ta đâu biết, người ta cưỡng ép mình đâu, trong nhà mình đâu có dám nói. Hồi đó còn khờ lắm, không biết vậy đó.
Of course, these two countries are not the only ones that deny that these acts took place. According to some historians, the role that played during the war is, even today, neglected by the United States government. It has focused on the consequences that the battles had on veterans. While this point of view is valid, acknowledging the sexual abuses carried out by soldiers would clash with the narrative of seeing these people as victims. But not only the country's leaders do not recognize these actions, but also other theorists, activists, and film directors, for example. Although the Vietnam War has been represented in a large number of films, few of them show or try to raise public awareness about the torture inflicted on women during it. Hundreds of victims continue to fight to achieve this recognition. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think that the governments of the countries involved should take responsibility for the acts of sexual violence? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.